Welcome back. It's time to mix our dough. I'm so excited and I hope that you are too. My leaven is at its peak and it just looks amazing. It has tripled, maybe even quadrupled in height. Looks just amazing. So what you're going to do is add your 150 grams of your peak leaven to a large container that has a lid. You want a container with a lid so that your dough doesn't dry out. You also want to be able to fit both of your hands inside of the container. So make sure the container is large enough that you can do that. And you'll also notice here that it's very difficult to get your starter out of your container and into the big, large container. And this is exactly why I mentioned earlier, and I think many times, that I like to add an additional 5 grams or so of flour and water. And as you can see, I used almost all of it. So now we're going to add 250 grams of slightly warmed water. And remember, it's still going to be the same filtered water or water that you've sat on the counter for at least 24 hours. I like it to be a little bit warm as I help it then keeps a nice cozy environment for your microorganism colony. Then give it a really good mix so that your microorganisms get well dispersed throughout and then they can move around all over the place freely. Then you're going to add 375 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. You can use the same flour you've been using all along to feed your starter. You can also make sourdough with all sorts of other types of flour. And I mentioned before that Teresa Greenway is my mentor, and she has some amazing recipes if you'd like to further your education. And now you can guess what I'm going to tell you to do now. Of course, we're going to mix. And this dough is about 72% hydration, and you'll see that a lot when you're reading sourdough formulas, and it basically means the percentage of water compared to flour in your recipe. However, it does include the leaven, so if you want to calculate the hydration of a dough, you need to account for half of your leaven is flour and half of your leaven is water, and add that to the amounts of water and flour to calculate the percentage. And being a high hydration, this dough is quite sticky, so you're going to find it a little annoying if you don't wet your hands. So that's a little tip that I learned from Teresa, just to always keep a bowl of water nearby and keep your hands wet so the dough doesn't stick to your fingers. So once you're finished sort of incorporating all of that dough together with your spoon, then just wet your hands and start mixing. So just gently knead it until it's all incorporated together. And make sure you don't overwork the dough. So sometimes when we overwork sourdough, it tends to get even more sticky and just doesn't feel quite right. So you'll notice that the dough will start to kind of tear if you're overworking it. And now a really good tip is to make sure that you're wearing an apron and that you take off your rings and you pull up your sleeves. This dough is so incredibly sticky, and when it dries, it becomes like cement. So if you get it in your rings, it is incredibly hard to get off. And if you get it on your clothing, you're going to have to wash it. It's just really difficult to get off. Now we start the auto-lease period. 2 hours in a nice warm spot. I always put it in a sunny window. So the bulk fermentation is now starting, but the time before you add the salt is called the auto-lease. And this is a rest time. And the salt slows down the fermentation. So you're wanting the fermentation to increase at this time. The auto-lease period is over and it's time for us to add the salt and do some dough yoga. Okay, so let's see how our dough is looking. And you see it's quite sticky. So before you start folding, put your water on your hands. But the first thing you're going to do is add in your 9 grams of sea salt. And I have Himalayan sea salt, but you can use any type of sea salt. And then when I do this, I just make sure my hands are wet and I just fold it in. So this is called stretching and folding, and it's done to develop the gluten. So you're trying to help, kind of like when you sprain your ankle and you go to a physical therapist and they do certain types of massages. What they're doing is they're trying to align, as the healing's happening, they're trying to align. I like to squish this like this. They're trying to get all the fibers to align up into And so they're not so haphazard. That's kind of what you're doing. You're trying to get the gluten bonds to strengthen into, I kind of picture it being like they're getting into straight lines almost, so that they're stronger. You're lining them up. So I like to just sort of mix in the salt, just kneading it a little bit. And sometimes you just have to wet your hands a little so they don't stick. So you see, it doesn't stick at all to your hands if your hands are wet. Some people like to add a little bit of flour to their hands, but I don't like to dry out my dough. But wet dough with higher hydration is harder to work with, but it's not that much. This is just a little tiny bit on your hands. So once you feel like you've incorporated the salt, so there's still some, and that's okay. You don't want to overwork it too much. So then I just flatten it back out. Try my hands again. And then you're just going to stretch and fold. So you grab one side and pull, and it might tear and rip because the gluten bonds are not very strong yet. And that's okay, don't worry. And because we just fiddled with it quite a bit, that will happen. So you pull from all four corners, up and over. And then once you have all the corners done, just pick it up and flip it over. And I always like to kind of smooth out my top a bit. And you'll notice as you're going along with your stretches and folds that the top starts to really smooth out. And then the dough is going to completely change. So stretch it out. And I like to put it in a warm place. So if it's really cold, you could turn on your fireplace and put it a little distance away. But remember, just like our starter, it likes that 24, 25 degrees Celsius or so. So we're going to now set this in our warm spot, and we're going to come back and stretch it again in 45 minutes to an hour. And we're going to be stretching at least 4 or 5 times. All right, we'll see you then. Okay, it's been an hour, so it's time to do our dough yoga again. I just made up that name. I thought it was so funny because I always love to stretch and fold myself. So this is called stretching a window pane. When you do your stretching like that, as you can see, the dough has completely changed already after only an hour. So we're basically pulling the dough up, grabbing the edge and just pulling it up and stretching. And as you can see, my dough's already gained a lot of strength. So you stretch and you fold it 4 times, 1 on each side. And you see that as I'm stretching, it's getting quite strong, but it's still tearing a little bit, which means it can gain a lot more strength. The more you fold it and stretch it, I feel like the better, but 3 is also probably enough. And if you're in a warmer climate and you're finding it's just fermenting really quickly, you're not going to need the 5 times like I do. So then you just want to flip it over and then flatten it out and cover it. Right, my 3rd fold. You can tell just by looking at the dough, it looks so much nicer. Look at that. It's very cold too. It's still so cold in my house, but look how that gluten's developing. So I like to take my time and just stretch it gently and get a nice window pane. I still don't quite get it, but I'll show you what that means. When you do this side, you sometimes have to hold it down. But I like to give it a really good stretch. And like I said, there are other techniques that rely completely on fermentation, just like the gluten-free method that I do. And the bread code, Hendrik at the bread code has an amazing formula that he does that just relies on fermentation, no stretches and folds. But I like this. I do that all the time. There we go. And look at that. You can already see bubble forming. You can just pat that down, squish it out. So this is my Bob Senior. This is the one I've had for years. All right. It's been an hour since our last fold. Let's see how, it feels so nice. This is the stage where you're going to notice it feels so nice. Look at that. So I think maybe maximum 1 minute cold. It's so satisfying. You can see that the dough is completely changing with each fold as it ferments further. We'll cover it back up, and remember, take your rings off. It sticks to your rings. I think this will be our last fold. Stretch and fold, I should say. Well, actually, it looks pretty darn good. Oh. This will probably be our last fold, and I think it's because it's so cold, my dough actually feels cold. I've had it wrapped up in a blanket, but it's still cold. I'm just going to fold one more time. We're almost finished for the evening. Now we're going to shape our dough. So we're going to dust the surface of our countertop or our cutting board with some brown rice flour, or you can use white rice flour too, if you prefer. And then we're going to take our dough out of the banneton. Rub some flour on your hands first so it's not so sticky. Dust your hands with the brown or white rice flour. Then you're going to lift the dough out of the container and make sure to put it top side up. So this is the one time you're not flipping. So now make sure that you do that, because this is the top of your loaf and it's developed a sort of skin because of the way that we did our dough yoga. So now what you're going to do is pre-shape it. So you kind of grab on the one end with your two hands and pull towards you, and you will see some tension form on the surface, and then scoop your hands underneath. And sometimes when you do that, you'll actually see little tears occur on the top. And if that happens, you've just pulled just a little too tight. So then you'll just sort of try to push that piece around onto the underside and try again. So just don't overwork it. You don't have to shape it perfectly. It's going to go into the banneton to get a shape too. And now it's going to have a bench rest for 15 minutes. I always use a banneton, about a 9-inch diameter one, and I put that inside of a large plastic bowl that has a lid. But you don't have to use a banneton. You can also just use a regular bowl lined with a tea towel, and I show this in my gluten-free sourdough starter videos if you'd like to see exactly what I mean. So after the 15-minute bench rest, you can do your final shape. So you're just basically repeating the exact same thing, trying to get a nice, lovely sort of dome shape. Then you're ready to put your dough ball into your banneton or your bowl with the towel. So you're going to dust your banneton with a little bit of brown rice flour, and this gives a lovely artesian look and it prevents it from sticking to the banneton as well. So once you have it nice and seasoned, then you're going to add your dough ball into it. Now your top of your dough ball needs to go into the banneton upside down like this. So flip it over and put the top down. So now what you see on the top, that's going to be the underside. So you don't have to worry too much about what that looks like. And now you'll just cover it with your lid. And it's time to chill the cold ferment. You're going to pop your dough into the fridge overnight for 8 to 10 hours, and we'll see you in the morning after the chill where we'll bake our dough. I'm excited for you. Good night.